Good afternoon. I'm Emilye Crosby, and I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to especially thank Dr. McDowell and everyone who made it possible for us to be here together at this symposium. And I also have a debt to the Woodson Institute that supported me for 2 years while I wrote my dissertation. And even more importantly, I think, brought me to Charlottesville, where I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Bond. I said this at another occasion when we were remembering Julian, and I said that it's not, as a kid, I grew up, and he was a hero. In our little school in Mississippi, we used to look at pictures of him in jet. And as I told him when I met him, well, not the first time I met him, there was a major Supreme Court decision that came out of Claiborne County, Mississippi, and the NAACP was going to have a big celebration, and he was one of the featured speakers that was advertised. And we spent the whole day looking for Julian Bond, and he didn't make it. He told me, when I asked him about it, that he actually had a difference with the NAACP. He didn't think that they should spend so much money on a celebration and that they should put that into voter registration. And as disappointed as I was, I couldn't argue with him. So Julian Bond, like so many in SNCC, made his first mark on history as a very young person. He continued making history throughout his life, and he also weighed in on the interpretations of history of his SNCC years. He was very concerned about how movement history was framed, and he gave us the phrase, the master narrative, to describe the sort of superficial top-down approach to movement history that's so troubling. And I've actually been looking recently at how SNCC people engaged with their history. And there's this one moment that I think gives us a nice insight into Julian Bond's sense of humor. There was a conference in 1988 in Trinity, Connecticut, organized by SNCC people reflecting on their history. And at the very end of the conference, there was a panel that included a couple of historians. And one of the historians who had just, I think he had published a book on liberalism, the unraveling of America. And he, and at the end of the conference, he said, he gave a list of things that he thought SNCC people should address at their next conference. And it included the fact that he thought that they had given up on liberalism too soon, and a number of other things which Julian subsequently refuted, most visibly at a Woodson Institute-sponsored conference, I believe. But at the time, in the middle of that conference, he circulated a petition. Oh, I'm sorry. One of the, me and jokes. So I don't have a history. I mean, a potential as a stand-up comic. But one of the things that the scholar said that he thought SNCC people should address at their next gathering was interracial sex, particularly sex between Black men and white women, which he thought was at the heart of the disillusion of SNCC, the historian. And so in the midst of the conference, Julian apparently circulated a petition for SNCC people to sign if they wanted to talk about their sex lives. And just to give it a little twist, the last signature on the petition was the wife of the scholar. I teach at SUNY Geneseo, and we had the good fortune to host Julian a few years ago. And in a seminar with my students, one of them asked him what he thought the difference was between their generation and his. And he said, well, I think that many of you in your generation are very compassionate, very concerned about people, very involved in service. He says, but we fought for justice. And I was like, wow. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And people mentioned yesterday that he was not intending to pass the baton to anyone. And yet he was not. He was delighted when a new generation of young people started snatching at it. And I think he was prepared to run alongside with the movement for Black Lives and provide the support that he could. Which is, as Tim Jenkins mentioned earlier, SNCC Legacy Project has gone on record with that kind of support. The Woodson Institute does not do formal introductions. You can read introductions to the panelists in the program, but I'll identify people. We'll start with Jonathan Hale, who's going to talk about the Freedom School students in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. Freedom School's ideas generally attributed to Charlie Cobb, who's also here with us, as you know. And then the rest of the panel, we're going to have a collaborative effort with Wesley Hogan, Rebekah Barber, and Ajamu Dillahunt. And I think lastly, the title of this, Students on the Front Lines, is at the heart of the symposium theme, the movement coming on, and reflects Julian, I think, at his best and throughout his life. And so, John.
Good afternoon, everybody. So first, you can hear me okay? Great. Well, my name is John Hale. I work at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, and I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois looking at the topic of the Freedom Schools, convinced that the Freedom Schools held the potential for historians, scholars, and practitioners to better understand the significant issues facing public education today. I was also convinced, still to this day, that they hold a particular historic truth that can help unlock the problems of educational reform today. So I was quite pleased when my book finally came out this past summer, and I'm here to talk briefly about this. But first of all, a special thank you to Professor McDowell for the invitation and the Woodson Institute for not only inviting me to speak, but also just hosting the symposium. And the conversations have been just absolutely incredible, and learning from so many other scholars and practitioners and activists, so thank you for that. I'll start, as so many others have started at the symposium, is starting with Julian Bond. He wrote a letter to Stoughton Lynd in 1964, in which he wrote, this is at the end of Freedom Summer, and he wrote to Stoughton Lynd, who was a Freedom School coordinator. He said, I have an idea for a really good book. He said, I'm going to call it The Freedom Schools, and it's going to document the stories of these young people who are in the civil rights movement now because of the Freedom Schools. He says, I want it published immediately. Well, 52 years later, we have books on the Freedom Schools finally, which he was able to review, to write in the light of freedom before he passed, and was very grateful that he could review that. Here's a letter in my book that came out this summer. I entitled it The Freedom Schools. You know, Mr. Bond wanted that, and I thought it was, of course, an appropriate name. But also draw your attention to the fact that he wanted them sold at 50 cents to $1 a copy. I think that was a great idea. My press didn't. So if you happen to look at that, and they're unconvinced that they should be sold for the price that Mr. Bond recommended. But regardless, we move forward with the history of the Freedom Schools. And the Freedom Schools were part of the larger, as we know, the Freedom Summer Project. There were 41 locations throughout the state of Mississippi. Freedom Schools, another reason for inspiring this project, is they're oftentimes remembered on the margins of the Freedom Summer. We remember the voter registration projects. We remember the violence. Remember the trio that was killed at the beginning of the summer. Freedom Schools were an integral part of the Freedom Summer Project that are oftentimes overlooked. And I feel like the historiography on Freedom Summer remembers SNCC, and they remember the core activists. They remember COFO. They, of course, remember the 1,200 plus white volunteers who moved to Mississippi during the summer to enact, essentially, the Freedom Summer Project. What we oftentimes miss is the students' perspective. Who were these 2,000 plus students who went to the Freedom Schools? What is the bottom-up or social historical perspective from the student's voice, the student's vantage point? So what I do in the book is I attempt to provide a history of the Freedom Schools and the larger civil rights movement from the Freedom School students' perspective. And the student I begin with in this particular book is Mr. Eddie James Carthen, pictured here in the Mileston Freedom School. He's also on the cover of the book. Eddie James Carthen was born in the Mississippi Delta on October 18, 1949. Many of his memories are set in the small community of Mileston, which is in Holmes County, whose history and collective memory extends into the antebellum era when white aristocratic planters reaped the rewards of King Cotton. The strain of cotton production still rested upon the backs of entire communities, like Carthen's very own Mileston, especially in the Delta, an area internationally known for its cotton production. White segregationist landholders after the Civil War maintained their commitment to an economic order that exploited black labor. Whites sustained this system of total segregation by race, oppressive race relations, and the complete political disenfranchisement of the local black population through strictly enforced racial codes. However, such oppressive race relations were always sites of resistance, and supremacy never existed free of challenge. Eddie James Carthen inherited some of these traditions of resistance. His family owned and farmed its own land since the 1930s through a federal New Deal program that spawned a small community of independent black landowners who developed cooperatives. They shared decision-making, and they essentially laid the foundations for the modern civil rights movement. As cracks in the overarching racial structure became more visible to those who toiled in the freedom struggle across the state during the 60s, Carthen and his community connected to a larger statewide and national movement. At the age of 14, Carthen and two other students attended freedom schools, and they joined the marches, boycotts, protests, and the front lines of the civil rights movement. And following their history, I also interviewed and got to know quite well Mrs. Areyla Mitchell. This is her father. She didn't want a childhood picture published in the book, so I respected that, but she wanted her father included. She lived in Holly Springs, Mississippi, northern central part of Mississippi. And she grew up in the environment of Russ College, which is in many ways like Tougaloo College, for those of you familiar with it, in Jackson, Mississippi. And I wanted to include Miss Mitchell's story today because of what we were learning about Julian Bond, and at the age of 4, getting to know Paul Robeson through his father. And here she was describing to me what it meant to grow up in the Russ College campus community. Russ College figured prominently in the development of the local movement in Holly Springs. Living near a black college afforded Areyla Mitchell and her father opportunities to observe firsthand the principles of the civil rights movement. Russ College provided a safe haven like that of Tougaloo College, which engendered an ideology that challenged segregationist policy in Mississippi. Growing up in an interracial environment facilitated by an integrated faculty, Mitchell remembered being immersed in conversations dominated by politics that introduced her to movement principles. Particularly when white volunteers began living in Mississippi during Freedom Summer, Mitchell remembered, quote, being in the middle of the movement. We had a lot of political discussions about Khrushchev and all of that, communism, socialism, capitalism. This intellectual environment fostered a political consciousness that characterized a freedom school education. The environment at Russ College also facilitated a strong civil rights network. Like other student activists throughout Mississippi, Mitchell met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on one of his several visits to Mississippi. She also remembered meeting A.G. Gaston, a black millionaire from Birmingham. The location of her home and the position her father held at Russ College, again, he was the chair of the business department at Russ, it played significantly in her eventual decision to attend a freedom school. As she recalled, Russ College was sort of the headquarters of the freedom school, and so naturally my father wanted me to get involved. In getting to know these students, you realize that it wasn't SNCC or CORE or COFO or even the NAACP. It was local Mississippians who were already active in the movement. They formed the networks. They forged the relationships that, promoted or facilitated this foundation of the civil rights movement. And getting to know Dave Dennis quite well, he also lives in Charleston. He always laments how people typically forget about the local Mississippians. And when you follow the Freedom School students, you can easily see that they were the ones who were already active before the volunteers moved south. Another theme I explore in the book is that of truly a revolutionary curriculum and pedagogy that the Freedom Schools endorsed that summer of 1964. And these are pictures taken from the largest freedom school, which is at the Baptist Seminary in Meridian, Mississippi. And here, I describe the curriculum in the pedagogy as that what Paulo Freire and Miles Horton call a critical pedagogy, or education for social change. And this began with the curriculum. And of all the students I interviewed, many of them, if not all of them, refer to the curriculum first and foremost. And when I was interviewing Chute Allen, a Freedom School teacher in Holly Springs, she recalled about the beginning of each Freedom School day. I start our teaching with what we call the core curriculum, which is Negro history and the history and philosophy of the movement. Such subjects reinforce themes brought up in some of the segregated public schools, but not all of the students have been learning a humanities curriculum based on African American history and culture. Students in Freedom Schools studied John Brown and the abolitionists and the prelude to the Civil War. They critically studied Reconstruction, and they examined speeches of Frederick Douglass. Thelma Eubanks, a Freedom School student in Macomb, remembered, we were introduced to Black authors who we didn't know anything about at the time. Richard Wright, James Baldwin. She also remembers Freedom Road by Howard Fast and Strange Fruit by Lillian Smith. We hadn't had any of that in school, she recalled. The Freedom School teachers put a library in the school, and many of the books were on Black history, recalled Homer Hill from a Freedom School in Clarksdale. Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, Frederick Douglass's writings, a wide range of books and plays. Roy DeBerry, a student outside of Holly Springs, remembered reading James Baldwin for the very first time in a Freedom School. So the curriculum was introducing students to literature oftentimes that they were not learning in the public schools. The instruction was culturally relevant. They brought in, as I mentioned, Black history, literature. They brought in local community members to speak to the students. It was student-centered based on their interests and needs. Mark Levy, who was a teacher from New York, was teaching at the Meridian Freedom School. He remembered trying to find French teachers because students wanted to learn how to speak French. To the students in Meridian, they knew that the white students were offered French at their school, and they thought something may have been wrong with them. But after mastering basic principles of French by the end of the summer, they learned that this was an act of discrimination and not some type of inferiority on their part. What is ironic about the Freedom School curriculum and pedagogy is that it points to successful education. Today, if you read through education journals, they talk about a culturally relevant education. They talk about teachers who lived in the community. If the Freedom Schools would have followed Julian Bond's idea and published this story much earlier, perhaps, just perhaps, we'd be much further along in educational reform because they were practicing effective education during the Civil Rights Movement. And what this led essentially is to educational activism. Another reason, an argument I try to make in the book is that we don't remember the Freedom Schools because they weren't oftentimes in the most visible spaces. Charlie Cobb referred in a presentation at the University of Illinois in 2008 and indicated that some of the white volunteers, and they actually wrote this in their applications, wanted to teach in the Freedom School because it seemed more safe than the voter registration project. People also forget that Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman disappeared after investigating the burning of a church, which a community in Philadelphia recently donated to use as a Freedom School. To white segregationists, Freedom School education was the same as voter registration. It did not matter what you participated in. A Freedom School education was just as dangerous as registering voters. In this activism, I want to pick up on an argument that Professor Derek Ulrich made yesterday in the Teachers of the Movement presentation, is that if we expand our notion of activism, we can see that these young people, SNCC was young, they're 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, which is very young, but these students, 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, being arrested on the front lines of the movement. But they're also practicing activism that is under the radar, if you will. And one activity was that of newspaper writing, which you saw on the cover of the book, too, is very popular. In fact, these newspapers produced the largest network of civil rights news in the state of Mississippi. Of course, white newspapers weren't covering the movement to the extent that activists would have liked, so Freedom School newspapers actually filled this gap in knowledge. And here's one such article by Miss Areyla Mitchell, who I referred to earlier. And she's writing about the mayor of Hollywood, who some of you may remember is Sam Coopwood. Mayor Sam Coopwood said he's a member of the Methodist Church. I wonder if he believes all men are created equal. If he does, I wonder what could be so bad about colored and white living together. I wonder if he can answer that question. As Booker T. Washington said, and I quote, "You can't keep a man in the hole without being down yourself." Don't you think that kind of fits Mayor Coopwood? While he's trying to keep the Negro down, he's really lowering himself in Mississippi. And just think, this is a 10-year-old student learning how to articulate a political critique and opposition. And I'll just begin to conclude here. Following the Freedom School students throughout the rest of their career, Areyla Mitchell's picture here across from President George H.W. Bush, she became a journalist. She founded her own newspaper called the Mid-South Tribune in Memphis, Tennessee. She went on to win numerous awards and accolades for her work as a Black journalist in the South. And she traces this to the Freedom School idea. Eddie James Carthen, at the age of 26, was elected to the local school board. He became elected mayor of Chula, Mississippi at the age of 30, was framed for a murder, and you can read the book to find more about it, of course, it's on your own as well. Framed for murder, arrested, right, but eventually freed because he was framed by white resistance within Chula in the early 1980s. He was later asked to speak to the United Nations about his trials in Mississippi, where he met Yasser Arafat and Nelson Mandela. The Freedom School students were activated during Freedom School, and if we follow their stories, we can just see how successful this civil rights form of education actually was. And to conclude, I want to go back to, again, something that Julian Bond, that we heard yesterday in the film clip at the extravaganza last night, which is outstanding, by the way. And remember his quote where he talks about education is as segregated now as it was in the 1950s? If we follow the Freedom School model, we can use historic evidence to ignite our imagination, to see that there is reform out there. The Freedom Schools not only inspired Marion Wright Edelman's Freedom School program, but it inspired the Algebra Project. The Baltimore Algebra Project is on the ground at the local level fighting school board policy. Let us not forget that Julian Bond was the first president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. They regularly publish scathing education research about the Southern system. We in Charleston regularly present this to the school board. They don't listen. But this information is out there. Education is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. And if we don't pay attention to it, right, we will be remiss to miss the historic lesson that we have from the Freedom Schools. And with that, I would be remiss to not turn over more time to our young student activists here. So everybody, thank you so much.
How y'all doing? All right. Freedom Land. So could we have all the SNCC veterans please stand?
We really just want to take the time to acknowledge you and let you know how much we appreciate you. From what we're told, all the SNCC veterans are Rutha Harris, Charlie Cobb, Emory Harris, Judy Richardson, Tim Jenkins, Chuck Neblett, I just met your wife, Jane Silver. I hope I didn't miss anyone because we really appreciate you all. So we just wanted to hold space. And we also wanted to begin something new. We wanted to start off with a chant, something that may be a little bit different than what you're used to, but okay. Ella Baker was a freedom fighter, and she taught us how to fight. So we gon' fight all day and right until we get it right. What side are you on, my people? What side are you on? We on the free side. What side are you on, my people? What side are you on? We on the freedom side. Charlie Cobb was a freedom fighter, and he taught us how to fight. So we gon' fight all day and night until we get it right. What side are you on, my people? What side are you on? We on the freedom side. What side are you on, my people? What side are you on? We on the freedom side. Rutha Harris was fight. So we gon' fight all day and night until we get it right. What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
Tim Jenkins was a freedom fighter and he taught us how to fight. So we gon' fight all day and night until we get it right. What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
Charleston was a freedom fighter and he taught us how to fight. So we gon' fight all day and night until we get it right. What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
Silver was a freedom fighter and she taught us how to fight. So we gon' fight all day and night until we get it right. What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
And of course, Julian Bond was a freedom fighter and he taught us how to fight. So we gon' fight all day and night until we get it right.
Turn up.
What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
What side are we on, my people? What side are we on?
We on freedom side.
That was powerful. In current movement spaces, we like to start off with chants and close with chants to kind of ground ourselves and keep the energy going. So my name is Ajamu Dillahunt. I'm a sophomore at North Carolina Central University, studying political science and history. North Carolina Central was founded in 1910, Durham, North Carolina. Our founder, James E. Shepard, graduated from Shaw University in 1960. SNCC was founded at Shaw University, so there's some connection there. And before I get into how I became conscious and how I got into the movement and how I grew up in the movement with my grandparents, I want to talk about there's a current war on Black America. And young people are committed to fighting back against the atrocities facing our community in a tradition that has been linked to African descendants in this country since we were kidnapped from the continent of Africa. So we keep that close to our heart and we keep that tradition alive of students being civically engaged. So my grandparents, my grandmother, she's from Charleston, South Carolina. She experienced the Jim Crow South. Growing up, her and a couple of friends went to the movie theater. And, you know, at that time, color had to sit in the balcony. So my grandma's always been a rebel. So her and her friends said, okay, we can go to the bottom. And therefore, she was arrested. And my great-grandfather was an educator and a part of the NAACP. And my grandfather, he's from Queens, New York, and growing up, he participated in the sit-in movements at the time when he was in college. And they met at West Virginia State University, a historically Black college, and then from there moved to New York and were part of the African Liberation Support Committee, and then came down south and was a part of the South African Liberation Support Committee, was co-founders of Black Workers for Justice, founded in 1982 in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. It's an organization that connect the labor movement and the Black freedom struggle. And they've been a part of countless organizations and efforts, and currently are working on building a community co-op in Southeast Raleigh, Fertile Ground Food Cooperative, out of the legacy and guidance of Mayor Chuck Wheeler movement in Jackson, Mississippi. So growing up, going to marches and rallies was a regular for me. It's something I often did, going to union meetings. My grandmother was the local president for the North Carolina Association of Educators, while at the same time my grandfather was a local president of the American Postal Workers Union in Raleigh. So growing up, it's always been going to union meetings, participating in marches and rallies. That set the foundation to my life. But in terms of me finding my way into the movement, the self-consciousness, it came the summer of my sophomore year in high school. I was reading the new Jim Crow, talking the age of mass incarceration. And it really transformed my thinking and way of life. And then an incident happened at a local high school, I believe the beginning of my junior year. And I told my grandmother I wanted to get involved because she was involved with education justice work. And I went to restorative justice training at Campbell Law School. When I learned about solutions, not suspensions, counselors, not cops, learned about alternatives, restorative justice practice, more counselors, psychologists, and social workers in schools to support students. And then I was involved with the youth organization called the Youth Organizing Institute and NC Heat, North Carolina Heroes Emerging Among Teens. Went to school board meetings, held press conferences, was a part of the Dignity in Schools national campaign. And we were really engaged in demanding human rights in our public schools. And now I'm currently a fellow with Ignite NC, which is basically an organization that builds a student movement in North Carolina. We have fellows on just about all 17 campuses in North Carolina under the UNC system. I'm also a member of BYP 100 Durham chapter. BYP 100 is a national membership-based organization for Black youth 18 through 35. I'm also a member of Black Workers for Justice. So that's a little bit about me.
And just a little bit about me. I'm kind of like Ajamu, grew up in the movement baby, kind of like Julian Bond as well. Most of you probably know my dad, Reverend Barber. And in my family, activism is something that is passed down from generations to generations. His dad was an activist, and he would go around with him as he traveled across the state to advocate for people, specifically the poor and disenfranchised, and that's something that my siblings and I did as well. So growing up, we really just absorbed a lot of information. And one thing that my parents always instilled in me, as well as my siblings, is to use whatever we have as tools to help other people. So, I would go with him, kind of like Ajamu said, to marches, rallies, meet different people, and come to a better understanding of the world. Actually, go back just a few to tell a little bit about my own personal story and why I'm personally indebted to the movement. Starting off, when I was very young, a baby, I was... No, okay. Well, it sounds funny, but I wasn't, okay. Apparently I'm a stand-up comedian, but when I was a baby, I developed hydrocephalus, and I ended up having to have brain surgery. Well, I'll tell you something really funny. I wasn't going to tell you, but now I will. My neurosurgeon was Ben Carson. There's a good laugh. But I ended up getting saved, and I had surgery, one other revision. As you know, hydrocephalus, when you have too much brain fluid in your brain. But I see myself as being saved as a reason to help other people. Now, every person doesn't think that way. But I know that I'm here for a reason. I was someone who had health coverage, so I think it's my duty to advocate for those who don't. And people are always surprised, you've never had seizures, you've never had any complications, no? So it's my, since I have the ability, I fight, like my parents have always taught me. So jumping back ahead, years later, growing up, learning, meeting new people, I met Julian Bond one time, and I'm gonna just throw this in here, because I don't remember his speech, but I do remember one thing he said, and it's a story that he told all the time about the babies being thrown into a river and how people kept rescuing them, but finally someone said, we have to go see who is throwing these children, what is causing the problem, what is causing the structural racism. So eventually, in my travels with my dad and activism, there were two experiences that changed my life and put me on the path that I am now in entering North Carolina Central University. One was going on a poverty tour where the NAACP, in partnership with the Poverty Center at UNC and the Institute for Civic Engagement and Social Change at North Carolina Central, which they've since closed for very political reasons, traveled across North Carolina and showcased extreme poverty in the state, how people were being poisoned and developing cancer because corporations were polluting their land, how people were literally having to live in the woods, how people were not being treated humanely at all. That was one experience, and I saw how students at North Carolina Central were engaging, and it inspired me. And then my second experience, because when I was in high school was when Trayvon Martin was killed. And I knew I needed to go to an HBCU when I kind of heard how my classmates were analyzing that situation and defending George Zimmerman, and I needed to get away. I needed a healing space. But what inspired me to go to North Carolina Central was traveling with my father and seeing students put together a protest. And one thing that Ajamu and I really want to uplift today, specifically because we are at a PWI, we want to uplift the importance of HBCUs. I know John just talked about the importance of freedom schools, but at my HBCU, a few things that I've gained was inspiration. Every day I come to school and I'm surrounded by scholars who aren't just scholars, but use their scholarly background as a source of activism, and who reach out to the younger generation. We're surrounded by the historic legacy. HBCUs, they used to be what we had to go to, but now they're a place that uplift us and train us. And now I'm about to graduate, but I really do truly feel equipped to go into the world and make a difference. Like I said, my family background gave me a lot of training, but going to an HBCU equipped me in so many other ways, gave me more empathy for people and more understanding of certain situations than I had before. And it made me realize how much we really do need to be, kind of like we just said, activist scholars, and why we need to train up this new generation. So that's one thing that we do want to focus on.
As Rebekah said, HBCUs play a vital role in social movements historically and in this current movement today. If we do not center HBCUs in our current movement, we have really lost the deep tradition of student engagement. If we really want transformative change, it starts at historically Black colleges and universities. Here, we had a Black University Summit September 30th to October 2nd at Shaw University due to our deep love for the legacy of SNCC. And the outstanding work that they did, and you all pioneered what youth organizing looked like. We use your revolutionary spirit to guide our movement today. We gathered at Shaw to discuss the role of students in this current movement for Black lives, which we'll go on more in depth and later on. But Black University, the idea of a Black university was pioneered by Black political scientist Charles Hamilton. He identified it as an institution that pushed away from white middle-class standard, an institution that allows students to think critically, to solve problems in poor Black community, and an institution that offers courses in Black and African studies. So we got HBCU students together in North Carolina to talk about the role we play in the current movement. We talked about Black political education, voting rights, and the importance of HBCU solidarity. And within the spectrum of voting rights, within the spectrum of Black political education, we had self-determination and Afrofuturism, civil rights and the role of students and social movements, and we had capitalism 101. We also had what does power look like to you and direct action training. And within voting rights, we had the history of voting rights, and then of course going over the voting rights trial in North Carolina. So this was a critical space needed because in North Carolina, HBCUs are under attack, just as we are across the country. We have a governing body of the Board of Governors. So those who enacted the voter suppression laws, HB2, and the police body cam laws not being accessible to the public are the same people who appointed the 32 governing body that controls our tuition, what schools get funding, and what programs schools can have. So Rebekah mentioned earlier, they cut the Institute for Civic Engagement and Social Change at North Carolina Central University, and it was vital in terms of voting rights and students being engaged in the surrounding community. The Board of Governors did that due to the corporatization in which the Board of Governors is going to, and the ability and the 32 governing body is only 4 black people and 0 attended any of the HBCUs in North Carolina. So that speaks volumes. They're making decisions for our institutions but have no experience. So this summit here, it started at North Carolina Central University with a press conference, and then they expanded into a conference. So we had 60 plus students and 7 out of the 10 HBCUs in North Carolina represented. We knew we had a duty to keep it alive, and we know as being institutions in the South that we play a vital role in this current movement. So we're going to have a strategic planning meeting soon. So students in North Carolina, black HBCU students, will organize and mobilize, and we do it with the deep love for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Oh, sure. And one thing that we do just want to emphasize, I know John was talking about Black University, but some other things that we've been organizing around, we've had solidarity rallies specifically to address the recent police killings. And from that, we've been able to gain support from students at PWIs. And one thing we want to emphasize is in order to continue this constant struggle and to move forward, we need to have solidarity between not just HBCU students, but Black students at PWIs. And I know there's sometimes a divide, and we were talking about it in the car, how oftentimes students at PWIs may get a little confused and begin to think that the goal is for, I guess, like self-improvement as opposed to the improvement of the people as a whole. We're all in the struggle together, and it's a constant struggle, so we need unity on all levels. And that's one thing Julian Bond stated during his lifetime. And one thing that we did find very interesting is that when we look at most of the SNCC veterans, especially the Black ones, were HBCU graduates, but understood the need to uplift Black students at PWIs as well. So it's a constant struggle.
And to speak a little bit on the historical analysis between the relationship of Black HBCU students and Black PWI students, a film just came out. I went to Carolina, the Stone Center, Agents of Change, the campus takeover at Cornell in 1969 with Ed Whitfield and so many other freedom fighters. And it featured in it, Julian Bond was speaking in support of those students who took over the campus, demanded Black studies and demanded development of the surrounding Black community. And the important role of the surrounding Black community, this is an action that we had in Durham for the Durham Beyond Policing campaign. This is the BYP 100 Durham chapter. And me and Mina, we're students she's a student at Duke, and I'm a student of Central at Course. But the major role of students is to obtain knowledge and help develop our surrounding community, right? Serve as a resource. As Charles Cobb said, and as he mentioned in his presentation about freedom schools, Mississippians led Mississippians. So we're going to let people in Durham lead Durham, but we're going to serve as a resource and sacrifice our institutions and our ability as students. So this is us at a direct action training. And a little bit more about the Durham Beyond Policing campaign. We're in opposition to the $71 million being used to build a new police headquarters. We see that money would be best to go towards housing, youth centers, jobs that pay livable wages, and so much more. So this is some direct action training and serving as a resource to the surrounding community. We were chained to the railing of the police station.
Oh, I didn't know this was up here. I guess this is some students from Central standing in solidarity with the Fight for 15 rally that was happening in Durham. Because as you know, as everyone knows, workers are so important. They're important because they keep things running, and they're important because they're people, and there are students who are workers as well. And we were talking earlier about the fact that because people don't have a livable wage, oftentimes students in particular are not able to finish their studies, so they have to drop out and then end up paying back their tuition and their fees. So So here we are, just standing in solidarity. We organized some students to go. And they ended up having a big rally downtown, and they marched from the McDonald's down to the police station. Okay, sure. I guess I wanted to say something before we go into Movement of Black Lives. Like, I really appreciate this, especially thinking historically, because I've been thinking a lot how SNCC in the 1960s, when they saw the enormous amount of violence that was occurring around them, they began to push for political power in an enormous way, specifically after the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. I was reading how that is what mainly ignited them to plan the Selma to Montgomery March, because we need political power, especially with what's going on. So this agenda, this platform, it's never been done before to this extent. So we really wanted to take a deep look at it.
How many of y'all have seen or heard of the Movement for Black Lives policy agenda?
So there are some hands not raised.
Okay, yeah. Everyone should definitely take a look at this. But the idea of ending the war on Black people, I also want to talk about how the war on Black people is international. And the Movement for Black Lives published this policy agenda with a deep love for the legacy of resistance of Black people in this country and Africans on the continent of Africa. So this policy agenda is very thorough and in-depth. And also when we talk about political power, when we talk about the campaigns that SNCC led and what it led into, Louds County Freedom Organization. Truly admire the work. It started off, as you all know, from a voter registration campaign from Stokely Carmichael and other SNCC veterans, and led to an independent Black-led political party. So really using that as a guiding tool when we talk about community-based grassroots organizing, what that looks like and the power that holds. So we really uplift that. I'm not sure if you have anything to say about that, but this is
yeah. I mean, yeah, really just uplift everything. I think everyone should go take a look at it when they get a chance and read it more fully in depth. But as an HBCU student, just really highlighting number 5, where they're focusing on the protection and increased funding for Black institutions, because I realize how Black institutions have historically been underfunded for very political reasons.
INVEST-DIVEST. So invest in community and divest from policing. So a lot of organizations now have taken on an abolition approach. They see full disarm, dismantle, and defund the police, and really fund programs such as, of course, education, healthcare, housing, restorative justice programs, harm-free zones, and things that nature that really contribute to the uplift of our community and get down to the grassroots of the problem instead of policing, which has been brutal to our communities. Yeah, so pushing for community control, really controlling direction, self-determination for Black and brown people, really controlling the direction of our communities. As Louds County, really like building up Black political power. And what it takes to do that, SNCC really provided like a resource, because in Louds County, as of March 1965, 0 Black people were registered to vote in a town that was 80% Black. But 20 months later, 3,900 Black people were registered to vote. And then that later then formed to Louds County Freedom Organization, where they used the Black Panther as their symbol, which really inspired the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense to use the Panther as their symbol. So a lot of times when we talk about the Panther Party, Louds County and their symbol seems to get overlooked. So I just wanted to uplift that.
Do you guys want to do the other 3, or do you want to turn it towards the audience? What do you feel like?
Yeah, let's turn it towards the audience.
Okay, so I'm so grateful to everybody for the spirit in which this conference is being held, and especially to Deborah. This is really exciting to see. But I have taken as my teachers the SNCC people, and one of the things that they shared is get out of the way. And so I met these young people earlier this year, and we live in the same hometown, but in some ways miles and miles and miles and miles apart. So seeing the resources after teaching at a state-funded HBCU for a decade here in Virginia and then going to Duke has really been stark and deeply, deeply unsettling. And so when I saw the work they were doing on a shoestring budget and with the values that they put at the center of their work, it was so inspiring to me. So I wanted them to take center stage and share with you some of the work that they've done and how it connects to the larger movement for Black lives. So they have a lot more stories, and I was privileged to hear a lot of them this morning. And so I might encourage them to come forward with them in the opening that we'd like to do now. But we'd really like to hear a little bit from you, and so I'll ask Rebekah and Ajamu to frame it a little bit, but we'd like to have some back and forth with the folks in the room, talking about the freedom schools that John so eloquently gave us an overview of, and talking about the freedom movement that Rebekah and Ajamu are part of today. Do you guys want to frame it a little bit for people, what you want to talk about?
I don't know. I guess if we're talking about freedom schools, I know as an HBCU student, as a student in general, we don't get a lot of our correct history until we get to college. Some students never get it. So do you all as the audience think that we need to incorporate freedom schools more and bring them back more? Yes. Yeah, me too.
Very small observation, but Tasha, are you still here?
Yes.
Nicole, are you still here? Nicole is still here? Oh yeah, you two stand up. In the summer of 2014. It's been a long day. In the summer of 2014, as a part of our larger 50 over 5 initiative, which is an initiative including courses, 50 over 5 commemorating the quote unquote modern movement for civil rights, we tried to replicate freedom schools in the summer of 2014 in a very, very successful course co-taught by Latasha Levy and Nicole Burrows. Latasha Levy, double who, and Woodson, former Woodson postdoctoral fellow, and Nicole, former Woodson postdoctoral fellow, now at Brown. Latasha is at University of Washington. So we tried to replicate the schools not only in the curriculum, but actually in the way the schools move throughout the community. So we had classes in barbershops, in churches. You tell them because you all tell them.
I think one of the most exciting things about that was really the classes that we held in the community. One, because it was interaction between UVA students and also and folks in the community around this history and around the present moment. And so it was like an exchange of ideas and also exchange of generations. And so it was a really powerful experience for me to be able to participate in that. And I think the other thing that students found really important was the need to be really active. We taught right before the Black Lives Matter jumped off, right? And so they would write us as soon as all the stuff jumped off in Ferguson. They were writing us talking about the parallels that they saw between 1964 and the present. And just another thing, well, let me let Latasha talk and then okay. The other thing too is freedom schools are so inspiring to me. And I participated in the CDF version of Freedom Schools when I was in college. And we met at Shaw University to replicate some of the stuff that was going on there. And I ended up working in Harlem Freedom Schools in New York. And then we started one for Black and Latina young women in Brooklyn. And we did that for 12 years. And so this stuff is really in my heart. And I'm so excited about the work that you all are doing. It's so impressive. And thank you, John, too, for sharing that information as well. But I just want to keep in touch with you guys and just lift you up, because I think it's really important work and really hard work at the same time. Because like you all kept saying, freedom is a constant struggle. And I think the long-term nature of it, people don't always get, right? And so they fizzle out pretty quickly. And so just to see you all keep it going is really impressive. So thank you so much for your presentation.
So I want to echo that. I mean, it's really important to understand that the Freedom Schools and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party were just two of the most radical innovations during that era that are largely overlooked and forgotten. But the other aspect of what was so powerful about that experience is that we did have students participate in what we hope were some community engagement activities, but our course was only 4 weeks. We met every day for 4 weeks, so it was very limiting in that way. We did get a lot of feedback, oh, you should offer this during the year, but we broke the classroom up into 2 groups. One worked on trying to engage people around voting rights and understanding what happened to the Voting Rights Act and the gutting of Section 5 and have conversations with people around that. And another group went into a local organization with youth and to teach them about what they were learning about Freedom Schools or the entire Freedom Summer Project. And one thing that really came up, and I want to ask you this question, the students were very uncomfortable with talking to people. And so even just to go to the church, you know, they were very uncomfortable talking to just going, you know, we were at a festival, I'm like, just go up there and introduce yourself and start talking. You would have thought that I asked them to cut somebody's head off, you know. And I wonder about this with the movement for Black Lives Matter, as it's, you know, in terms of it starting on social media. It's been very masterful in terms of using social media to get the word out, to get actions, you know, in play. To raise money for bail, to offer alternative news sources when we know news media is lying about what's happening on the ground. It's been masterful in that way. But it's also a barrier in terms of people-to-people ties that was really important for STIC as far as doing this kind of organization where you get out and you talk to people and you listen to them. And that's not, you know, you're not socialized to do that. You're socialized to use your phones. You're socialized to do, you know, to get likes and get followers on Twitter, rather than to actually build relationships with people. I think Dream Defenders was transparent in terms of how social media was tearing them apart, and they did a social media blackout. Maybe they haven't recovered from that, because even we know when you send emails to people, stuff gets lost in translation, there's passive aggressiveness, you misread somebody's tone, and it can create all these kinds of problems. So I'm wondering, the main thing about Black Lives Matter that I think people don't realize is that so many people are doing so many things on the local level that we just don't ever hear about. And so you might be saying they need to be doing X, Y, and Z. They are doing these things. So I just wonder if you know, if you could tell me if there are some efforts within people who are affiliated with any kind of movement, broadly speaking, movement for Black Lives, around actually building relationships and doing these types of things offline, off social media, to build those people-to-people ties that were so critical for SNCC's influence during that era.
Oh yeah. It's a lot of people who are foot soldiers in our current movement. BYP 100, I can only speak for Durham and what we do in Durham on a local level, but folks go to the bus station, folks go to schools, folks go to like the local community where a lot of Black and brown people are. So it's a lot of people who are trying to maintain that one-on-one, face-to-face level in person, because there's nothing that can replace that.
Right, and I know for a lot of times, especially for us as students, social media is the starting point, but it's not the end point. It gets us in the same room together, but from there we continue to build conversations.
So in Charleston, we've had a wave of organizing after you may remember Walter Scott, shot that 8 times. And then just 2 months later, we had the A&E tragedy, and Charleston really began to organize after Walter Scott, and this carried over with A&E too. Something that Charleston adopted was following Jack Odell's, what he called the Democracy Charter, which was a coalition charter based on numerous groups who were already active in Charleston. So we're working with Black Lives Matter, Quality Education Project, Elder Project, other groups involved, South Carolina Progressive Network, and you create a charter for your local area to have everyone sort of plug into that, because there are so many coalition groups involved locally that this Charleston Charter has all provided us a framework so we all can stay on the same page. And that's what Jack Odell envisioned when he first began articulating the idea of a democracy charter, and he really pushed that idea for local communities to follow. And we're finding in Charleston, at least, it's very effective for coalition building because, as you referenced, so many times people are working against each other, they don't even know it, or they don't even know others exist. But that charter is a way to sort of plug into a framework where everyone can sort of check in with one another.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for your commitment and your youth and your enthusiasm. I wanted to offer a unique perspective to the importance, I think, of freedom schools. I was raised in a middle class, very conservative Jehovah's Witness home. And I was blessed enough to go to Howard University for undergrad, where I came into contact with people with really, really interesting ideas about Blackness that I had not at that point had. Without that experience, had I just come from home and gone to maybe a PWI, I wouldn't have gotten that information perhaps. And that's why I think things like freedom schools are really important for that reason, among others, for people that may come from backgrounds like mine, that otherwise would not get the information. I mean, of course, maybe in classes, and if they're lucky enough, but would not get that activism, not get that inspiration and that motivation, and not understand the importance of it. So for no other reason than that, absolutely yes, they're vital. They're very important, and thank you.
I just wanted, it's been just fantastic hearing you guys. But I was also wondering, we're doing a lot of work with our SNCC Legacy Project.
Certainly with discussions with the larger Movement for Black Lives. We had a big meeting at Duke with BYP 100 and Charlene, and Umi came in, and from Trayvon Martin, and Dream Defenders, and just a lot of young people thinking about a lot of different kinds of things. But it was very interesting. Two things. One is it was very interesting to hear you particularly highlight the Lowndes County organizing that we did, because some of us here were in Lowndes County when we moved in, and we did not, support the march, the Selma and Montgomery March, because at that point, SNCC is saying we don't do big marches. It takes the focus off community organizing, and it's not worth it. And so John Lewis led that, but he led it as a private person at the beginning of that march. Now, once Bloody Sunday happens, we go back in, because you don't let people die. You don't let people stand by themselves. So we then send a whole SNCC effort in there so that Ivanhoe Donaldson becomes Deputy Director of Logistics for the march from SNCC. But that's because stuff has changed after Bloody Sunday. But my question is, around the Freedom Schools, one of the things that we're working on now as a SNCC Legacy Project is an educational initiative related to how you teach the Black freedom struggle, and in its larger expansion of democracy way that it really was. And so I'm coming out of Eyes on a Prize, and I remember how we used to do teacher workshops doing that, trying to say, how do you as teachers bring this curriculum into your own schools? The teacher initiative that we're working with Duke and a number of other people on, including Teaching for Change, and let me just lift them up. How many people know Teaching for Change? All right, hello. Teaching for Change, aside from the fact that the head of it helped me move into my new apartment, aside from that, I've been working with Teaching for Change for the last, 6, 7 years. They do, this is a network, a national network of progressive teachers all over the country. 60,000, that's true. They have a network of 60,000 progressive teachers. So my question is, there are teachers now in the public schools. It's like Deborah Metcalf, head of Teaching for Change, then I'm going to stop. Teaching for Change sent me a link to the fact that, did she send you that link? Seattle, Washington, I want to say it was 300, might have been 600 teachers and educational professionals last week came out with Black Lives Matter t-shirts in Seattle. This is not Memphis. This is white. So we're talking all these teachers who are coming out with this stuff. My question is, how do you see a way that, yeah, freedom schools are really important, but how do you start insinuating into the regular public schools? Because there's some fertile ground in here.
I actually have that exact same question. And I think the problem is that the vast majority of the teachers in public schools aren't that progressive. There's only a small subset. So ideally, I wish it could happen, but I know my experience in grade school, I had to basically get my own education and read to find out, information. I was surprised that in North Carolina, you never hear the name Ella Baker in schools. Never hear the name Abraham Galloway. People from North Carolina. So it's really daunting, and I don't know. I wish, as a whole, people were just more progressive. Then we'd have a more progressive teacher pool to pull from. But I don't know.
Sometimes it's just one or two teachers.
True, that is true.
Just add a small point. I think that progressive teachers are great, but there's also the larger high-stakes testing and culture of schools. And so even teachers who would like to teach this face many barriers. So I think there are all kinds of structural issues as well.
I will also say that in terms of how we teach this in schools is that you'd be surprised, two of the most conservative states in the country, Mississippi and South Carolina, actually have laws on the books that require the teaching of African American history. It's in the law books, but they're not being implemented. So what we're doing in South Carolina, because we're the only Western, how much of a contract that is, but the only Western country not to have education in our Constitution, you have to work at a local level. And we're finding when you put pressure on the local school board, and this is working in Charleston because it's predominantly white and they're afraid of being called racist. So when you can publicly state this information, that they're reacting quicker, and they've donated a few $100,000 of professional development to update teachers' knowledge on that. But the law's on the books, it's just people have to find out and educate ourselves if your state has the laws on the books, and you can begin to work with that to create pressure. And we are finding that it's working in Charleston. In Charleston, they just created a civil rights history course. They're piloting it right now in the district, and we're seeing some progress with that. And in addition to teaching for tolerance or teaching for change, the Zen Education Project is also very good as well in terms of resources for teachers.
They're both related.
Yeah.
So, Tim?
I'm on the board of Teaching for Change, Timothy Jenkins. And I want you to know that it's online. Teachingforchange.org will allow you to plug into the network that was just talked about. And it will describe some of the practical programs that are being implemented around the country. So, and you will also see a bookstore there. TFC.org or books.org is a books that can be enriching to the syllabus that you have in your high school. Those teachers need to know that there are alternative books to the ones that are offered by the school board. And I also think it's important for you to understand that there have been initiatives to get after-school programs in churches to do the same kind of thing on a private and voluntary basis. Once upon a time, we tried to do that, and we found that the churches became such a ravenous over the revenues that they ate up the program. So what we need to do is find ways to do that all over again. When I was in high school, I went to a predominantly Jewish high school, and they had Hebrew school after the daily school. And it was the Hebrew school that they learned their culture, their religion, and their roots. We need to have the equivalent in black churches and black after-school programs. We tried to do this nationwide with almost $1 million grant from Kellogg, and then the bishops and the preachers started fighting over who was going to control the money, and it was ruined. If the students do it themselves, then maybe we can have an honest program. Do it.
Yes.
Just a side note, Teaching for Change as we speak is doing the study guide and the PDF for Rosenwald. But my question is, for the two young activists, I think one of the great lessons of Julian Bond is also running for political office. And I mean, that's really where a lot of the change is going to come. And I'm just wondering if you know that about him and John Lewis and others, and how important that would be, that you think about that in the future.
So Rebekah, why don't you take that and I'll get the image up while we do. Oh yeah, because I just remember we forgot a picture. But I think that is the great thing about Julian Bond, because I noticed that he kind of dabbled in everything. He was a writer, Congress, like everything, sit-in, yeah. So, and I've noticed that about a lot of the civil rights leaders, how they were so diverse in their fields and Renaissance people. And I definitely, that's John Lewis. I did get a picture with Julian Bond, but it's somewhere. I'll have to find it. Because like I said, I met him one time. But I definitely think it's important for us to be fighting from all corners. We need to. And one thing I find especially interesting as a Black woman is how vastly underrepresented Black women are in office, despite the fact that we comprise such a high portion of the electorate, how underrepresented Black people as a whole are. And of course, it's not the cure-all, but we definitely do need to be fighting from all corners. And I definitely do recommend young Black people running for political office. As for myself, probably not so much. But,
let me add just one point. And I think one of the lessons from SNCC is that not only electing people to office, but having an organized electorate.
right. And real political power, not just the vote, but like having the ability to really change policies. Because we have the right to vote, and we've been voting. But a lot of times it just doesn't come through, and we really need to find a way to make substantial change.
Yeah, and also understanding, as with Loudoun County, the reason for going was due to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party not getting a seat at the Democratic Convention. So reapplying that to today and understanding that our freedom will not come through the Democratic Party. So organizing those independent Black-led political parties in local communities is really what's needed.
Yes. And while we're on that note, let's just lift up another name, Miss Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And how even today we're still fighting for that seat at the table, but how she paved the way for us. I think that's a good.
So if everybody could join me in thanking these two extraordinary